But folks, if you're joining us, this is starting to record. Actually, I can stop the recording. I forgot that.
Yeah, pause it, start it again later. There you go.
Okay, everybody. Welcome to ASEV Eastern Section, Hang Time, Grapevines to Wines. My name is Nathan Eason, your host. I work with the University of Georgia as a county extension agent in the Northeast part, where we do some grape growing in our region up here. And we are glad to have you for our discussion today. And we hope that our audience will be involved in our discussion. This is definitely more kind of podcast conversation style. We have our guest speaker here today who will speak and educate us, but we also want y'all to participate as well. In order to do that, what we need you to do is you're all muted, no video, so you'll raise your hand icon if you want to verbally speak, which is fine. I'll be glad to let you speak to us. Or if you just want to type in your question or comment in the Q&A box or chat, I will try to keep an eye on that. And that's how we'll do that. So you're welcome to chat anything. We got some folks from up north in Minnesota, so this is a nationwide audience, and we are glad that you could join us today. Without further ado, I'm going to let our guest speaker, Fritz Westover, introduce himself. Fritz.
All right. Hey, thanks a lot, Nathan, for the invite. And I'll do a really quick intro, give a shout out to Madeline in Minnesota, since she said hi. Hi, Madeline. My background is in viticulture, and I've worked as an extension advisor for almost a decade, both in Virginia and Texas, if you combine those. Worked in California for a nonprofit doing vineyard sustainability, research and extension type work there as well. And I've had my own vineyard consulting company officially since 2013, where I help growers primarily in Texas, where I'm located now, but also I'm working with growers with feet on the ground in your great state of Georgia, Nathan. So I get to collaborate with you occasionally. I also collaborate there with Rachel White-Caton, who works with me very closely, both with consulting and with my online business, which is a little bit different than my consulting. There's some overlap there. That's known as Virtual Viticulture Academy. And that's where I do my online teaching and education component. I also do feet on the ground in Arizona. I don't want to not mention that. And I've done on-ground consulting and advising in many other states, but mostly Texas, Georgia, and Arizona. All of these states are using to some degree irrigation, and that's going to be the topic of today. Mostly not scheduling irrigation, but using products through irrigation. I know you're going to introduce the topic, but we do that a lot in Texas and Arizona, and even in other arid states as well, where irrigation is present. So the academy that I work in has members in several states across the country. You can visit that at virtualviticultureacademy.com. And in the last year and a half or so, I launched a podcast that's called Vineyard Underground Podcast. And that's where I hang out here in my studio where I am today and talk to grape growers and experts around the globe. And that's been a lot of fun too. And you can find that on Spotify or Apple or wherever you get your podcasts, wherever you stream your podcast. So those are the three things that I'm up to the most these days. And I'm also an active member in ASEV Eastern Section and National. And I get the great pleasure to help with the scholarship fundraising. And that's been a great joy. So that's my background. Been doing viticulture over 20 years. Gosh, it's gonna be 25 years soon. I better watch out.
I know it sneaks up on you in a hurry, and you took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to let everybody know you are a part of ASEV Eastern Section. We welcome private industry as well as academia in, sales reps, or whether you're a winemaker, a grape grower, vineyard manager. This organization is open to anybody. And to me, what I love about it is at our conferences is, we get to showcase a lot of the in-depth research that we're doing, and hang time is just a kind of a time to give you a glimpse of that. But it's a great opportunity to come to our conference, and that's what next month's session is going to be about, is what to expect in Cleveland, Ohio this coming up year, or this summer. And that's ASEV-ES.org is the website to find all of that conference information. Without further ado, that's 6 minutes in for some good introductions. So let's get to the meat and potatoes. When I was coming up with topics across the year, one of the things that seems like is becoming more and more of a deal is possibly using drip irrigation. Now, it's definitely nothing new. Across the country, people use drip irrigation for irrigation purposes. But what we're finding out is there may be, or there definitely is, opportunity to use other applications of that. So we're hoping to find out here today and be able to answer some of your questions. So again, please ask questions. If you are using drip irrigation on your farm, we would want to know how you're using it, if you're using certain products, what those products are. We'd love to hear your testimony as well. So definitely speak up. But otherwise, I want to have the opportunity on a national platform to introduce these things. And Fritz, with your experience across the country and consulting, I definitely saw it as an opportunity for you to share what you're seeing and how people are using it. So, and some of you may be on the verge of, hey, I'm considering this because we're getting a lot of insect pressures, or we're getting this, that, or the other, whatever that might be. We're considering it, using it for fertigation or some kind of chemigation, application. So we're going to cover those briefly as we go across, but so, I think the first thing we need to do, Fritz, is just talk about, what is the setup? What is necessary to think about this? There's got to be like, hey, do we have access to water, and how much water? So, I don't know, kind of give us a little bit of a rundown on, what's kind of setup is necessary for this.
Yeah, no problem. And one of the interesting things, and one of the things I was wanting to discuss, is that there are states that historically have dry farmed their vineyards that are now, because of other benefits of irrigation system in terms of delivering some type of product, whether it's a biological product or a fungicide, insecticide, maybe even an herbicide, or most commonly fertilizers. Some states that are normally not irrigating are now considering not only putting in irrigation just to help get their vineyard established, because those establishment years are healthy. And sometimes we plant a vineyard and have a drought year and you're out there watering by hand, and that's tough. But there are also some states like yours in Georgia where Pierce's disease in recent years with warmer winters has come into even higher elevation, and it's taken back a significant number of vines. And we've dealt with this in areas like Texas and the Southeast, but it's not really been historically a problem in some of those other states where it hasn't been as warm. And now there's a lot of vectors. So Pierce's disease, for an example, there's a vector in the woods. There's over 35 of them or so, probably more than that in Texas. And there's mild winters, and the vectors are basically feeding on wild grapes where the bacteria that causes the disease lives, and then they bring it into the vineyard, and then you see vines dying in those vineyards within years. So some of the growers I work with now are putting in irrigation systems so that they can do similar to what is being done in Texas and some of those other states where we can grow vinifera, but there's a challenge in some years where we have high pressure. So it's nice to be able to do treatments that are more effective for those areas. So putting imidacloprid out as an insecticide treatment to keep the vectors out of the vineyard is just one part of a comprehensive program to prevent Pierce's disease. By no means should any grower be dependent on just an insecticide, especially a single mode of action insecticide, but it certainly is one thing the growers can do in addition to everything else they're doing in the vineyard. So this has posed the question that you have, what is needed to put in irrigation? And so I'll tell you, the growers I work with are going to do it one of two ways. Rainwater collection is probably not a valid option. If you have a very big pond, or in Texas, they call it a tank in the ground, that pond, which you're hopefully lining or has a clay lining or some kind of a synthetic lining, you need water to be coming in there from rain, and you need an abundance of it to collect it. And if you're trying to use irrigation for frost protection, which is a totally different topic, you need an abundance of water because you've got to run the system at a high level for a long period of time. If the freeze is going for 10 hours, you need to run it for 10 hours. And if you run out of water, you're in trouble. The good news is, for a well or for a pond where you're just irrigating to deliver a product to your vineyard, you don't need as much water. In Texas, the extension service, our rule of thumb back in the day, and I still use this to this date, is if you just want to irrigate your grapevines during the hot summer months when there's a drought, you need about 5 to 10 gallons per minute well output for every acre of grapes that you have. I've definitely seen vineyards get by on the lower end of 5 gallons per minute. So that means if your well puts out 25 gallons per minute,
You're good.
Probably do 20, you could do about 5 acres of grapes, right? You divide that by 5. So it could be 5 acres, definitely 2.5, 3 acres. You can maintain as far as water goes. What's interesting is if you just want to use water to get by during dry spells, if you normally have reliable rainfall and you want to use the well to just deliver product to your grapes, whether it's some of the newer biological products, fertilizers, or any of the insecticides or fungicides, you don't need as much water just to do that because you're just putting those out once or maybe twice per season. And so it's a very, very low water demand just to deliver that product.
You make a good point. I think you can look at high pressure systems and low pressure systems. I guess I can say I'm fortunate to be able to witness a vineyard here in my county who actually did install a frost protection system through water. And I feel like they would stand by that it served them pretty well. Everybody else is the standard wind machines and smudge pots, things like that, but they actually did the water emitters, and I don't have the pictures today, but definitely the ice cakes up and protects pretty well. But they do have irrigation ponds to pump out of. We in our discussions yesterday, we did make that separation that it's not the same thing. These others are low flow systems, where if you're doing emitters on 3 and 4 acres at a time, and that's small scale vineyards, you're going to need a lot more water, a lot bigger horsepower pump. Well, that's a good rule of thumb, Fritz, and thank you for sharing that. So let's just dive into starting off with some fungicides. When we think about fungicides, I've always just thought about as surface application, spraying. So when we think about fungicides potentially for the soil, do you have some examples or things where we would use that?
Yeah, so I would say by far 99.5% of all of the fungicides that go out in growers' vineyards, at least that I work with and advise for, are foliar. And that's the whole idea. Get it on the leaf surface where it can protect. But there are some systemic products that can be taken up by roots. And so growers have used these in certain situations. It's not very common, but the number one situation that introduced me to using fungicides in drip irrigation was the onset of cotton root rot, or as people from outside of Texas like to call it, Texas root rot. Just put a blame on Texas, right? So you go to Arizona, it's Texas root rot. This is what you're going to find in soils that are very high pH, like over 8.0, heavier clay soils where moisture sticks around longer. And this fungal disease, which is a root rot, can basically get into roots, cause decline and sudden death or apoplexy of vines. And it's common in cotton crops as well and some other crops. And there's really no way to know if it's in the ground unless you've already had a cotton crop or a crop that's sensitive to it before the grapes were planted and you've noticed that you've had some decline. So there's been some research in Texas and in other areas that have shown that you can apply a fungicide to the root system, and that's systemically taken up. And this is flutriathol is the chemical name, and TopGuard Terra is the brand name. And so these applications are usually made around bloom, and then they go out about a month later and do split application. You'll find that split applications are common because there's a pre-harvest interval with a lot of these products. And so you want to get as much season-long protection as you can. So they put out a treatment earlier, or when the highest susceptibility period starts to begin. Usually we know new root growth is occurring near bloom time. So you want to protect those new roots. So a lot of times they're making an application just before bloom and then maybe 30 days later, but the growers always paying attention to pre-harvest intervals. And one thing that you can see is that most products that go in the ground are going to have a longer pre-harvest interval than products that you spray on foliage or on fruit. And that's because there's a long drawl that comes from the roots that systemically takes that product up into the vine. Some of these products that are used for cotton root rot, and then another product called Rhyme, which is a number 3 FRAC group for fungicides. So you're familiar with Raleigh and maybe ASEV-ES as one of the newer FRAC 3 groups, or any of your difenoconazole, tetraconazole type products. This number 3 group, Rhyme, that's RHYME, it actually has a label for soil application too. So when I talk to my colleagues in California, for example, where powdery mildew is the main disease or pest, not pest, but the major fungal disease, sometimes when they're growing young vineyards, and I don't know if you've ever tried to spray down into a grow tube. It's usually, number one, a bad idea, and number two, very impractical. You spray down in there, and the spray concentrates on the leaves, and they get stuck against the tube, and they burn, or it causes toxicity in some cases, and you just don't get coverage. So growers in California and other areas where powdery mildew is the primary disease have used these products for first leaf or maybe second leaf to control disease inside those grow tubes. So that's another reason. Now, if you're growing already a disease-resistant hybrid variety, probably you don't need to go through that extreme. Most growers are going to wait until their shoots and their leaves come out of the tube and just spray with a foliar spray. But it does offer a way to get protection.
Well, Bruce, I know that the soils here in Georgia are pretty heavy. I mean, sometimes really a heavy clay system, and the years that we get a lot of rainfall. Matter of fact, we've had 2 or 3 years of good rainfall here in North Georgia. And I haven't got any reports as of this year or anything, but in the past, whenever we have seen some root rot situations or some vine decline, and they're just deciding to go ahead and rip those out, the concern is are those pathogens still in the soil? And there's definitely some of these soil application drenches I see would be a huge benefit for having something like this on plant backs or replants. Sometimes those are skips, hits and misses, but sometimes we say we're just going to pull out an entire a line of vines. And in this situation, I think that would be a great application for some of those.
Yeah, and I'll comment on one more that might not be on everyone's radar, but the phosphorus acids are also in that group that are mostly for oospores, so downy mildew, but they can work on Phytophthora. In fact, they've been used in potato crops as applications because they're highly systemic and can move from foliage to roots. But if you look at a product called Rampart, which is one of the phosphorus acid products, and pull up the label, for those of you who are not familiar with checking labels, if you want to know if you can put something through drip, it's got to be on the label. You can't just go ahead and take something and put it on the ground. And typically it needs to be put through an irrigation system if that's how it says it needs to be delivered on the label. So if you look at the Rampart label, go to cdms.com or wherever you want to find the label, you'll find that they have a foliar application. They have and they also have an irrigation application. And so the rates are going to differ. And so I have seen situations where growers have planted grapes and to a replant or even to a new site, and the roots were small, right? Because it's a new vine, it's a young vine. And so they had problems with pathogens that are normally not going to kill or cause vine decline, like Fusarium, Pythium, or Phytophthora. So especially with Phytophthora, that is one where phosphorus acid could work. So you could apply that through your drip irrigation. It's not a hardcore fungicide. It's from the phosphites group, but it might have enough effect to keep those healthy roots going until they establish into enough soil that they can get through that establishment period, and then maybe it's not needed anymore. So I definitely have had other viticulturists tell me they've applied phosphorus acids directly to soil. So that is an option as well. So you have to check your labels. So those are the main ones I'd say for fungicides would be the Top Guard Terra for cotton root rot, which will also control powdery mildew and black rot. One of the things that Texas A&M researchers observed anecdotally during their trials with Top Guard is they certainly had a lot less black rot in those trial blocks too, because it also protects systemically for black rot. So it's getting into the vine. It's not just moving into the roots. So the number one requirement is it must be systemic to be taken into the roots, because we're not just trying to kill stuff in the soil. We're trying to get something to go into the plant roots and either protect the plant roots themselves or go into the vine and protect the foliage, fruit, or whatever else is in there. And this is going to be the same when we move into insecticides.
Absolutely. Well, that's a good transition. So we kind of briefly talked about insecticides, and for the most part, you think of only systemic insecticides being applied to the soil. I don't know of anything else other than nematicides, controlling nematodes. would be something that we didn't talk about too much, but there may be some application there. But again, Pierce's disease being a huge issue here in Georgia and across some of the Southeast and certain areas. And I know you northern folks on here don't deal with that as much. You may have other sap-sucking insects that may be of interest. I know this spotted lanternfly is a interest to a lot of states. And I don't want to speak out of turn because I'm not 100% sure if imidacloprid would control the spotted lanternfly, but let's talk about imidacloprid. You know, I know that I've heard rumors, and I don't want to speak incorrectly here, but imidacloprids, you know, while they are systemic and great, you know, I know in the nursery business on flowering plants, this whole increased awareness of pollinators and things like that has really drawn a lot of attention to the use of imidacloprids. It would really be devastating to the industry if that ever got pulled, especially for states who were trying to control for Pierce's disease and is using it. But I know, Fritz, that we've talked and you've mentioned that, you know, you've made this recommendation to some growers that are just seeing too much pressure. Again, we like for them to grow some vines that are more resistant to Pierce's disease and more tolerant to some of these things. But at the end of the day, we like to have our diversity in our portfolios. So love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I mean, so when I started working in the Gulf Coast of Texas, the main varieties I'm working with were Pierce's disease tolerant varieties. And if Pierce's disease is an issue in your area, you should first consider growing hybrids that are tolerant or resistant to Pierce's disease. And we now have more than we've ever had in the past. They come with other challenges. You still have to spray fungicides on most of these varieties, but there definitely are growers who can grow vinifera successfully in their climates. And Pierce's disease is becoming more and more of a threat, like in the North Georgia mountains or North Carolina, areas that are kind of on that margin where the disease tends to hang around and the weather permits for it to move into those higher elevations. And so, I always encourage growers to look at the label, find out what's registered in their area, in their state, follow the label. But if you look at the label on most imidacloprid products like Macho 2.0, Macho 4.0, they're both Macho, but they are different formulations. So the rates differ. They're different concentrations of imidacloprid. Wrangler, Admire Pro, these are all brand names that have been out in the market. And there's a lot of generics now that we have such wide use of it. And now that the Admire Pro patent has gone away many, many years ago. So these products are generally applied through drip irrigation at strategic times, and the grower needs to know when the vectors are coming in if you're thinking about Pierce's disease, which in Texas is typically close to bloom. So sometimes we'll put something in the drip system after we get our plant tissue results back from bloom and put a fertilizer out. And sometimes the fertilizer can be compatible with the imidacloprid, so we'll do both. So the point is, you can use these products and they will systemically go into the vine and they'll control or deter any vectors from feeding on the vines. And they've been proven to be very, very effective. If you've ever looked at the work from Nick Toscana, he came to Texas to talk not too many years ago. Actually, it was more like 12 years ago, but he had come to speak, and Temecula was devastated by Pierce's disease. And one of the biggest changes that was made was the use of imidacloprid insecticides. There's typically a 30-day pre-harvest interval. So growers have found, and that study by Toscana had shown that if you split the full rate per year application into 2 applications, you get a little bit longer activity. And so you can cover the vines for a longer time throughout the season. So typically somewhere around bloom or fruit set, then maybe 30 days later, the second half to boost, but there's that 30-day pre-harvest interval you have to be wary of. But here's the thing, if you spray imidacloprid and it rains, if you spray it on the foliage, or if you spray a fungicide like mancozeb or sulfur and it rains, that will basically wash that non-systemic product off the leaves, and you have to go out and spray again. The same thing can happen when we put things through the drip system. And we'll talk about the process of doing that a little bit later here if you want kind of those tips and tricks on making it effective. But if you put out your product and then it rains 3 inches right afterwards, some of that's going to leach and maybe not be available. Right. So you have to consider the conditions for applying these things and try to set it up to be ideal for a long period of uptake without leaching, and then having non-target non-target, what am I trying to say here, Nathan? You don't want to hit the wrong target. You don't want to go into groundwater. You don't want non-target waste of your
Oh
product.
yeah.
So these are all important. But if you look at the imidacloprid label, it's not just labeled for Pierce's disease as a soil application. There's a foliar application. If you're using Wrangler, for example, it might be 1.6 ounces per acre. And then if you look at the soil application, it's 16 ounces per acre. So you're putting a higher dose in there. So if I have a grower who just wants to knock back a minor foliar pest like leafhoppers, we can spray 1.6 ounces of Wrangler and knock them back. If they want to do it systemically and also control other things, they're going to need to put out 10 times the amount, 16 ounces per acre. So the cost is higher too. But my point is, the timing of putting it out is important. The weather conditions around when you put it out are also very important. And you want to make sure that you're not wasting money doing it. Also, if you can do a cheaper spray application for whatever it is that's bothering you, and you're already spraying fungicides and you can mix it in the tank, then just do that. But on the label for imidacloprid, you'll also see a label for phylloxera, for nematode, if you want to knock back or it's not going to completely control nematodes, but you're putting it into the soil, into the root system, and you're getting a little bit of knockback, basically.
What about Japanese beetles? Does it help prevent some of the chewing?
I've not seen that. I've not seen any research. Usually these pests that are large insects that are chewing a lot of foliage, I just haven't seen it used for those. Something like leafhoppers, very small leafhoppers, and whiteflies, or any of your Pierce's disease vectors like glassy wing sharpshooter, the Oncomatopia, or Bona, or any of the other, whatever, 40 or so or more that are out there. So those are the main targets really there.
Sounds good. Move on to herbicides. So this was kind of one, and maybe just a brief mention of it. So, a lot of people used post applications of or not pre-emergent, but post-emergent applications of herbicides, Roundup, glyphosate, glyphosate, others. But it's definitely encouraged to use some pre-emergence around your vines if you have some vegetative and weed issues. And you had mentioned just possibly using Prowl H2O, which is a grassy weed control. And I just never thought about using that. I mean, when you think about a drip irrigation system, it's going to kind of puddle around that vine. So you get some, I guess, immediately around that vine, but may not give you a 4-foot wide band if that's what you're used to.
Yeah, and I'm not going to talk a lot about herbicide use to the drip because I'm not quite sure I like the idea of it personally. But I do know some growers who are in areas where they rely almost 100% on irrigation, and they really don't have a lot of weeds except for that wet area where the irrigation is dripping on a regular basis. So growers are going to control weeds with whatever means they have, whether it's mechanical, whether it's spraying, like you said, a glufosinate burn back herbicide or something like that. But some growers in larger production scale where they have issues primarily right around that dripper have used products like Prowl H2O. It has been labeled safe for drip application. Of course, you've got to make sure you've got good distribution uniformity. We'll talk about that later too. But some growers will put it out right at the end of an irrigation set at the beginning of the season, before weeds start to build up in the system, and that will keep that wet area where the dripper's hitting without weeds, at least for a longer period of time.
It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, so they're putting it out. It's one of those yellow herbicides, right? They put it out right at the end, put it into the topsoil, drip, because one of the things about some of these pre-emergents like Prowl H2O or even Chateau, which I'm not talking about now, I'm talking about Prowl H2O, they need to be rained in. So you need a 1/4 to a 1/2 inch of rain for them to work into the soil and then prevent germination of these weeds. So you want to get them out before the weeds start, but the irrigation allows you to rain it in to that wet area. So that's really the main use I've seen for it. It's not the solution to weeds. It's a tool that growers use to prolong weeds in that specific area where the dripper's hitting.
Sounds good. Again, want to remind our audience, if you have questions, to please type those in the Q&A box or raise your hand and I'll unmute you. So definitely just want to remind you of that.
We got a shout out from Cleveland. We got a shout out from Ohio. We got a shout out from Maria Smith, put a link to the CDMS site I referenced. Thank you, Maria.
Bruce Zoklin said hi, Fritz.
Hey, Bruce Zoklin in Florida, probably surfing, retired, hanging out. Yeah.
Well, one of the biggest things that people use these drip irrigations for, these systems, is fertigation. And I know that in my research as a grad student, I was working on in a cattle situation where we were applying fertigation, nitrogen, urea, pretty much UAN through irrigation. And just what you said to the point of herbicides, a lot of times these things need to be watered in. So if the rain isn't working with you when you want to get those granulars dissolved, you have a product that's already dissolved. Obviously, there's probably systems where you can buy it in liquid form, or you can buy, I guess, pelleted and have an agitator and be able to dissolve that fertilizer, whichever system they go with. And we talked about kind of ahead of time, we weren't going to get into the details of which system you should buy and all of that. I mean, you could have a whole entire presentation on the different types of pumps that you can use, the different agitators, the injectors, siphons, the cost of running, header pipes and whatnot across your vineyard can just change dramatically across the country. So we weren't going to get into the details of that. I know Texas A&M has some great resources on some of these different types of systems. So if you want to have a starting place to look at some of them for that information. So I am going to pause and answer Bruce's question. Fritz, ever use VPD as a means of determine when and how much water to add? This gets a fair amount of discussion in California because it's expensive equipment and is not needed. Bruce.
Yeah, that's an irrigation timing, management, and water demand question. So I'm going to keep on topic today on products that we use in our irrigation. But to answer your question, no, vapor pressure deficit is not something I currently use with my growers for irrigation. I will say I rely primarily on soil moisture monitoring. I use a company called Sensor Insight that are based in Texas, and we monitor how deep the water goes because we're injecting stuff. We want to make sure it goes to the root depth where our majority of our roots are. We want to know when the soil's drying out so we can water ahead of a drought or of a high demand for water or ahead of a heat spike. We want to make sure our profile is filled. And the second thing that I think is most important in irrigation terms is looking at plant water stress. And so using either a leaf pressure bomb or a leaf porometer in conjunction with soil moisture sensors gives you another piece of the equation. I very rarely rely on weather alone. And I don't have experience using vapor pressure deficit as a primary means of testing water demand of vines. I know that there's whole companies that do that out in California where water is so precious and basically they're looking for tools that they can use and plug and play to know when to water and how much to water to track their evapotranspiration. So, but I'll stick to the
no, that's a good, we talked about this might come up, there's a whole states that talk
I'm
about
happy
this.
to answer. I mean, what my experiences are, but I guess my answer would be I don't have experience with that in particular.
Yeah, thank you.
But a very good question. So I want to thank the person. I think it was Bruce.
Yeah. So going back to fertilizers again, speaking from experience, we saw that putting a fertilizer through irrigation directly to the plant at proper, measured out levels instead of just side dressing. And our soils up here, sometimes we're trying to get a phosphorus dose to the plant if it was potentially not done as properly at establishment and vineyard prep. So you kind of saturate the soil with that phosphate and hoping that you're going to get some leach out, but a lot of phosphorus will bind to our soil. But in addition to that, it's sometimes your micronutrients and some of those deficiencies. And you pointed out based on your tissue analysis that you're doing. And if you're not doing that tissue analysis, that flowering and that veraison, your plant's talking to you. And it's most universities have the ability to do tissue analysis on those vines and help make those proper recommendations. But it's just a great way to water and make sure that product gets in to that plant. So types of fertilizers, liquid versus soluble. And, one thing we talked about, Fritz, you mentioned it a minute ago, was compatibility. A lot of times we got to make sure we're not going to get any kind of burn or any kind of coagulation or something crazy is going to happen in our mix tanks. If we're trying to throw in an imidacloprid with a fertilizer application or any other biological products. And again, we're going to kind of glean over that a little bit, but there's a lot of projects that discuss soil enhancements and mycorrhizae health and root stimulants and things like that. So, we got to be careful what we mix in our tanks with our fertilizers because we could turn into a mess.
Yeah. So no, absolutely. There's, if you're on the fence about whether irrigation is needed in your region, maybe you're in a region where you can dry farm, but maybe, number one, you have Pierce's disease is a concern. Maybe you have other soil-borne pests or issues that maybe irrigation could be a practical approach for addressing. If you just want to be able to apply your fertilizer efficiently with less fertilizer per acre, put it right into the root zone. So you're going to be able to push it down into the root zone at exactly the time the vine needs it, or just before that peak demand, and not have to drive equipment over top of your soil or burn diesel to do that. Then irrigation gives you another great method to apply fertilizers and save money and time. You can turn on a fertilizer injection and then go and scout your vineyard and do other stuff. So the type of equipment that we're using is either, some kind of a metered injector. So there's going to be common brands would be a Dosatron, a Dosematic. There's other Mix Right. Those are 3 brands right there. And those basically tie in upstream of your filtration system. And that's a really important thing because if you're mixing something together and it doesn't jive well in your tank, and it goes to your out to your emitters and plugs them, that's a huge problem. And you may not be able to unclog that very easily. And then you're injecting acids or something else to do that. So you want to catch those things at the filtration level so you don't run into issues. But also some people just use a Venturi type system, which you're just making a tee off of your main irrigation line upstream of your irrigation. You're putting shutoff valves on and off valves to reroute the water through that dog leg, if you will. And then you put in a smaller pipe piece there that creates a Venturi and suction effect. And then you run a line down into a tank or a bucket, whatever your receiver is, or receptacle is for your product, and sucking it into the line. And the advantage of having the more expensive, Dosatron, Dosematic metered injectors is that you can dial them in and inject over a slow period of time versus fast. And I'll talk about why that's important in a minute. I'm going to talk about the fertilizers first, but I wanted to give everyone a visual of, okay, we've got this big pail or bucket or tank that we're throwing products in and or mixing and dissolving them with water. They have to be compatible. And there's compatibility charts out there. Usually your fertilizers will say, if it's for injection, what they're not compatible with. One of the issues that growers come across is if they're trying to put out micronutrients or macronutrients as a spray on the ground, this is what growers who don't have irrigation will do. If you're saying, well, I'm spraying glyphosate or glufosinate, why don't I just throw in some boron or something like that? Well, with boron, you can do that. You can actually put it in your tank with your glyphosate herbicide and spray it out on the ground. And it's a non-charged nutrient. So it's our element. It's not positive or negative. It's going to not interact or react with your glyphosate, and it's going to move into the soil with water. But if you're trying to get magnesium sulfate out, and you mix that in your tank and put your glyphosate in with that, it's going to completely bind the glyphosate and make it useless. So there's certain things that are just not compatible in a tank, but you could apply them through the drips. And my point is things like you mentioned UAN, that's the ammonium and the urea-based nitrogen. It's usually 32%. You can easily inject that through an injector system. It comes as a liquid, right? You could buy ammonium sulfate, which is a soluble grade ammonium sulfate. If you want nitrogen and you're okay with an ammonium form, you can dissolve it And the rule of thumb is typically for every pound of soluble fertilizer, you need at least 1 gallon of water. So if you're thinking of doing injections and you've got a bag of soluble stuff, it might be Miracle Grow you're putting out there. I don't know. Please only put out what your vines need and when they need it, but you need at least 1 gallon of water. And if your problem is that your injector's pumping at such a high rate, you can't control it because you just have a Venturi, you really can't control the amount of time, then dilute the product with more water and put more water into the system. But the whole idea is we're always going to be dealing with a rate per acre of fertilizer, right? So if a 3200, that UAN is 32% nitrogen, that means we need to look at the weight of that fertilizer per gallon. There's an equation that's pretty easy to do. But it's usually, if it's about 10 pounds per gallon, it's going to be 3.2 pounds of nitrogen in that gallon. So if you put out a gallon of UAN 32, it's not exactly 3.2 pounds. It's very close to that. So if your objective is to put out, 5 units or 5 pounds of nitrogen per acre, you only need about 2 gallons of UAN 32. And the reason this is different than your broadcast application is if you've been applying, let's say, ammonium sulfate or calcium nitrate as a broadcast application in your vineyard in the spring because you don't have irrigation, number one, you've got to put it out earlier around bud burst because you have to get rains to come in the spring and move it into the soil and dissolve it. And it's got to push down to the point where it gets to the root zone. So that's going to be 8 to 10 inches down into the soil. Number two, okay, so number one, you need the rain to do that. Number two, you need to get it out way ahead of the peak demand so that it's going to be in the soil in the root zone by the time the peak demand comes around bloom or fruit set. And number three, you've got to probably put out more like 10 to 20 units or pounds of nitrogen per acre because some of it's going to get lost to volatilization. Some is going to be taken up by the cover crop if you're broadcasting it, or the weeds that are under your row. So we can apply 1/3 to 1/4 of the total fertilizer if we put it through the drip. So if your vineyard's very large, that's a pretty big savings year after year if you're applying fertilizer. So yeah, nitrogen easily put out. Phosphorus can be put out and pushed into the soil, like you said, so that you can get it to the root zone, whereas normally it doesn't move into the soil as a top dressing application. Things like magnesium sulfate, highly soluble in water, you can put those out. But just consider your soil pH, because if you're putting out ammonium sulfate, magnesium sulfate, and all these sulfur-based fertilizers, and you already have a acidic soil, it's going to make
driving it down. Yeah, it's worse.
It's driving it down. So be careful what you choose. But
those are good points. And that's the thing is here, whenever, people go to our ag supply store and they're trying to do a little fertilizer granular in their fields, they're just broadcasting it. And there's only so much goes underneath the plant. And there's not if anybody knows some equipment, I would be interested in that. And that is, side dressing equipment. I mean, I'm sure people have gotten creative and pouring granular fertilizers down a pipe and riding down the road in a gator or something crazy. But sometimes those are a little more difficult. Where I see this fertigation as a great thing. Any other points on fertilizer, Fritz? I mean, I don't have anything.
I'll just talk about timing. Make sure you understand when the peak demands are. I mentioned that nitrogen, that peak demand is, leading up to bloom and fruit set. But if you put out a big bunch of fertilizer, right before bloom, and you get a lot of rain and you produce too much vigor, that can actually compete with your fruit set in some cases.
Too much vegetative growth.
Too much vegetative growth, yeah. So if you can dial it in and spoon feed through irrigation at just the right time, you could put out a very small amount, like 1 gallon per acre, to get your 3 units of nitrogen early in the season. And the best time to do that is when you have about 5 to 7 fully unfolded leaves. So think about the vine early in the season growing its young shoots, and the leaves are just pushing out. It's pushing from carbohydrates and reserves that are in the wood, so the trunk, the cordons, and the roots. And it's really not actively taking up anything from the soil. Nothing significant. But once you get to that 5 to 7 fully unfolded leaves, and this is something that I learned from Marcus Keller, who wrote the book on the science of grapevines, so I'm standing behind it, you have transpiration happening. So you're losing water from the leaves as they transpire. And then that creates that suction in the roots that's bringing new water into the vine. And with that, you get nutrients, right? And especially stuff that flows with the mass flow of water. So if you understand what those nutrients are, you can understand which nutrients you can put out and that will be taken up right away. And those would include things like nitrogen or potassium or some of your micronutrients or magnesium sulfate or magnesium, which are highly to moderately mobile in soil. And so you can put that first dose of nitrogen on when you have, 5 to 7 fully unfolded leaves. That should get you through to your bloom. You can do your bloom tissue analysis. And then if you need more nitrogen, you can make an application to the drip immediately after bloom that will help you through your fruit set and ensure that your shoot size gets to where it needs to be. And what's also really nice about that is you have not compromised or contaminated your leaf tissue with any foliar-based fertilizer. So when you take your plant tissue sample, especially if you do whole leaf, which is what I really like to do, leaf with petiole, you get a lot more contamination on a leaf with a foliar spray of micronutrients. But if you put it through the drip, it never touches the leaf. So whatever that leaf is showing, is coming from the soil and it's in the plant, not sitting on the surface from a spray you made. And the exception would be sulfur, zinc, and manganese if you're spraying sulfur and manzate or mancozeb.
Well, and I don't want to divide the waters, but I guess I'm a soils guy. So I've always leaned on do your tissue analysis, apply to the soil what your plant needs. But I think a lot of people rely on foliar applications of micronutrients and things. And I think that, I know there's uptake, but is that a Band-Aid to the problem? I mean, that's kind of what we preach here. Like that's a Band-Aid. It'll get you through the season, but let's try to get those micros and macros into the soil. That's where the plant's going to be healthier long term.
Yeah, I would say if the foliar spray is the Band-Aid, Nathan, then the soil injection through irrigation is like the physical therapy. It's going to get you through a longer period. It's going to get you through the season. There's probably even possible carryover to the next season. But I do agree, if you want to make a system change to your soil, if your sum of cations is the problem and your magnesium and potassium are out of balance, or your calcium, then you want to do a broadcast and change that the whole system in most cases. So sometimes I'll apply dolomitic lime on acidic soil because we want the magnesium. It's 10% magnesium. We know that's going to move into the soil, but we don't want to decrease our soil pH and make it more acidic by broadcasting a bunch of magnesium sulfate. So
there you go. We've got another question from Bruce real quick. There are some interesting results reported in the hydroponic industry. Are you familiar with using hyper oxygenated water for vine irrigation?
Yeah. Is this Bruce Zoklin, by the way?
It is.
Of course it is. I feel like I'm having my master's, defense all of a sudden again. Thanks. The answer to Bruce's question is no, I don't, because I haven't even actually heard of that. It sounds pretty interesting. But there are all kinds of products you can find out there that are marketed for helping your water penetrate your soil better. So if you have problems with your soil crusting, there's products that are supposed to disperse that and allow better penetration to allow better water uptake by your plant if you have limited water resources. And I don't know if any of these work, but I'm interested in the fact that people are using them, especially where water is poor quality, like salty water, claims of using products that will bind the salt or make it less plant available. There's all these other products that are out there.
Sea salts was the one when I was in grad school on forage production. The different sea salts extractions and things that they had a lot of the micros. As extension person, sometimes it's very hard to find the research on these. Of course, the companies have done their research, but we're supposed to be fair and balanced and go to the non-biased research that we're doing. And sometimes it's not there potentially. And I'm always encouraging people to do split applications. Can you see a difference? And try to do as much data and record keeping as possible on that. And because most of the times I'll ask people, "What, did you split your field?" "Oh no, I put it out on the whole thing." And it's like, well, how are we going to know if it's working or not? So
yeah, no control, no.
So we won't want to turn you down on that, but like it potentially might be one of those. It depends, and try it on your side as long as it has no harmful effects on your grapes. We got about 9 more minutes, and I know we've put through, if we're rotating fungicides or fertilizers or different things, you're using the same system. So How are we cleaning that system, Fritz?
Yeah, well, there's one more thing I wanted to touch on really quick,
Sure,
Nathan,
absolutely.
cleaning it, and that is the rule of thirds. And this is something that I tell my growers all the time. The question is, hey, I injected my fertilizer. Oops, it went out in 5 minutes. What do I do now? Well, if there's certain way to inject something into your irrigation system, we're going to presume that the uniformity of your system is really good. 85% uniformity is considered really good. Better than that, you're doing better than industry standards. But when you don't just turn on your irrigation, throw your tube down in the bucket of fertilizer or insecticide or whatever it is, and just launch it out into your vineyard, because what happens is your system will take time to pressurize. So number one, you want pressure regulation in your system, and you want pressure regulated irrigation emitters, because if they're not pressure regulated, that means wherever your water is going to the lowest point or to the first point in the line, that section is going to get more of the water, or it's going to get watered longer at the beginning and end of the cycle. So that pressure regulation and pressure compensated emitters are really important when you design your system. You also want to design shutoff valves so you can either not treat some sections, like you just said, Nathan, or avoid treating areas that don't have problems when you want to target a pest or an issue. But the rule of thirds that I mentioned, let's get back to that. The general idea is if you have a good pressure compensated or regulated system, that if you're normally watering for a 9-hour period of time, you would take the first 3 hours, the first third, and you would just water with straight water. That would pressurize the system, and it's important to pre-wet the soil, because if the soil's pre-wet, then whatever comes in after that is more readily going to disperse and percolate down through that water, that pre-wet soil, into the root zone. And the roots are already kind of stimulated and activated. And so then the second third is where you start your injection. Now, that doesn't mean if you're irrigating for 9 hours that your injection has to be 3 hours exactly. The minimum, though, that I've kind of concluded after talking to lots of experts and working with my growers is that it's going to be at least a 45-minute to 60-minute or 1 hour injection period, because you want to make sure you're not dumping it out too quick. If there are any issues with uniformity, it still has a long enough time to spread that distribution out over time. And then that last third is where you're done injecting and you're just moving water into the system, and you're flushing all the product out of the line. You're pushing some water on top of the product so that it moves down, not just in the surface where fertilizers can volatilize, or where maybe it's getting to the weeds if you have some and not to the grapevine roots. You want to push the water to get it to move down to your root zone. And if you don't know where your root zone is, you need to go out and dig and figure that out, because you want to put the product where the majority of your feeder roots are going to be. So that's going to be typically in your top, maybe down below 4 inches, 5 inches, and then from that 5 inches to 12 or 18 inches, depending on your soil. And then the other thing that I've learned over time, also talking to experts who inject fungicides and insecticides, is that you want to get that emitter as close to the crown of the vine as possible. The crown being where the trunk branches out into roots, right at the base of the trunk, because that is by far the greatest area of uptake. It's going to have the majority of roots that are there available for uptake, and it's going to be closest to your trunk. So if you're looking to punch something into the trunk that's going to the foliage, you need that. If you're trying to control something that is a root rot or an insect that is in the soil, you probably need to wet the whole soil surface area. So it's going to be different, and you just need to think about what your pest is, where it is, and if the product needs to be taken systemically into the plant or just be put in the soil. So those are really important things that took me about 10 years to learn. And those are the things I want everyone listening to know they need to think about, because if you just willy-nilly throw something out in your line, it might not do its trick. In fact, I've seen where Pierce's disease was really bad on edges of vineyard farthest away from the injector or from the risers for the irrigation system, because most of the product went out into those first vines in the row and didn't get to the end. So that can be a problem.
I'm glad we didn't skip over that, Fritz. Those are great points. Pressure regulated emitters and the rule of thirds. Good advice.
And then the last part is just, you mentioned injections and cleaning. There are products that my growers put out occasionally to clean precipitation from their irrigation water, if they're a high calcium water, or if you put something out through your fertigation system and it's precipitating. and clogging, then there's things like sulfuric acid, which is dangerous to work with, and you've got to wear your protective gear, but you can inject it into your system, and no, it doesn't burn the roots of your vines. By the time it gets to your system, the goal is to bring the water in the system down to about 5.0 or less. So you've got to learn how to inject properly to do that. Some of my growers use a product called N-furic, which is a nitrogen-based acid, sulfuric acid. So if they need a little nitrogen and acid, they'll do a spring application of N-furic, a couple gallons per acre. That helps clean out the lines. I won't go into irrigation maintenance here, but definitely the injection system, there are products you can put out. If it's a biological clog, if you're in a high iron soil and you've got iron bacteria from your well that get through the filtration, you could use bleach, or you could use hydrogen peroxide type products for biological clogs. But I think the coolest thing for me, if I'm going to have a final word, is that there are biological products that are coming out constantly to be used as fungicides, insecticides. A lot of these products are considered organic. They're OMRI approved. And I'm really interested in how those can help soil health or plant health through systemic acquired resistance, so that we have products that are not broad spectrum fungicides or insecticides that we're putting in the soil, because no one wants to do that. The reality is some growers still are doing that, and I still think my point is valid. You can use these injection systems for organic products, biological products, organic fertilizers, compost tea. There's a lot of other uses that I think get overlooked. So when you're considering the cost of your irrigation system, the maintenance, everything else, make sure you have 2 or 3 good reasons to have it in there. The number one should be delivering water to your vines. And then after that, what else can you get kind of as a bonus?
One thing I want to kind of conclude on, Fritz, is there's a lot of products out there that is a liquid product. And I know I had this discussion on like liquid limes to adjust pHs in soils. And those things do exist. And kind of what some of our specialists told me is, well, lime that can be suspended in a liquid has to be ground extremely fine, and you still can't oversaturate your, call it a batch for lack of words. So you are getting true lime, but sometimes the amount that you're getting is definitely not near equivalent as using, conventional ag lime and doing a surface application. So the point being is, sometimes I think the takeaway that I've kind of applied through education is, be aware that anything that's suspended in a liquid has to be suspended. It cannot precipitate out. We do have agitators and things like that, but sometimes, the amount, there's like a liquid carbon, and I don't want to knock anything or the other. And these liquid carbon products they're great, I think, as far as what they are, and adding carbon to the ground, and that's a good thing. But even if it was liquid gold, when we talk about the application rate, it equivalented to out to like 0.003 milliliters per square foot. It's like, even if it was perfect, you put out so little of it on a per acre basis that you really wonder about its efficacy. So it's just try to use some thoughts. As we said, try to do some trials on your vines, and most of these things are probably not harmful. But as you mentioned, want to make sure compatibility is probably number one thing before you throw it. Do the old jar test before you throw it in the system.
Yeah, I agree. And Nathan, my last thing that I'll mention is, if anyone has irrigation already and has no idea what their distribution uniformity is, or how well their system is applying equally the water to all vines, on my podcast recently, episode 41 of the Vineyard Underground podcast, I interviewed a true expert on the topic, Dr. Franklin Gowdy. It was called Mastering Irrigation Distribution Uniformity with Dr. Franklin Gowdy. He goes over all the things you need to be looking at to make sure that, especially if you're injecting a product through your system, much less water, that you are checking these things, and it's not that hard to test. So that's, again, episode 41 on the Vineyard Underground podcast. If anyone's got irrigation and they're not sure if they're doing what they need to maintain it and keep it running and uniform.
That's perfect. As I mentioned, Texas A&M's doing ongoing research. I understood it. I don't know in detail, but Fresno State is as well. Again, probably more on the irrigation application side, but that's a whole system. So to learn that system, those are good places to start. Our folks on the West Coast who are doing this and have been for quite some time, get that dialed in. We're kind of out of time. Hang on, one question did pop up real quick. What do we have? Just great job. Thank you for that. Thank you for our audience. This is going to be recorded or is being recorded, going to be put up on our ASEV Eastern Section YouTube page. So if you just type that in, you'll find our page and our videos. Please feel free to share it in your states to your constituents and fellow people. But it's a great topic, Fritz. Thank you so much for joining us. It's good discussion. The future is uncertain with certain insects and diseases and what have you. So it's definitely, as we would say, another tool in the toolbox. So that's good stuff. But I'm going to stop recording.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.